My name is Dakota Pike, and you guys are listening to the Better Ideas Podcast. Hey guys, this episode is a little bit different because I recorded a few days before I'm recording this because in the intro, the first one I recorded at least, I totally forgot to mention the fact that I was nominated or put on the ballot in some way to be a part of the Best of Lawrence 2018. It's sort of a competition run by the Lawrence Journal World with the help of Lawrence Magazine and some other public entities that are doing some really cool stuff in the community. And I feel so fortunate to be recognized in that way and to be eligible to be a part of this. So thank you guys, seriously, for making that happen, because it just wouldn't without you. Obviously, one of you guys are the ones who put my name on there in the first place, most likely. So thank you guys sincerely. And if you haven't voted, you can just go to the community tab and then you will find the podcast section. And I should be pretty close to the top of the list because it starts with a B. So this episode is just kind of for fun. I was trying to distract myself a few days ago because I pulled something on my side and I wasn't feeling too great. So I just decided I'm going to do something random and I'm going to give you guys some recommendations for other podcasts to listen to, because I recognize that there are a lot of people who have come up to me and said that they're sort of unfamiliar with podcasts and they don't know what else to listen to. So I decided to just compile a list of the 10 podcasts that I think I probably listen to the most and enjoy the most. And it's going to be a fun one. And you guys will probably take something from it. You might find the new favorite podcast because there are so many that are better than this one. But this one is getting better, so it'll be up there with them someday, hopefully. But that wouldn't be without the help of you guys. So again, thanks for I'm feeling the love, and thank you guys so much for everything so far. And here's just a goofy little episode from me. All right, guys, this is probably going to be the most cliche way to start the episode about top 10 favorite podcasts, because he's already on the number one list of probably every podcast list known to man, probably the number one in the world. But the Joe Rogan Experience is definitely one of the most important podcasts to me, and it's got to be number one simply because I cannot dismiss the greatness that is Joe Rogan. To be honest, a lot of the changes that I've made in my life and a lot of the direction that was set in the past year, a little over maybe, was because of listening to powerhouse people on the Joe Rogan Experience and Joe Rogan himself. He's definitely got one of the most versatile minds of any human being on the planet. I guarantee you that. He can hold a conversation with neuroscientists, biologists, politicians, UFC fighters, comedians, actors, everybody. I mean, the guy he's so relatable because he's interested in so many different things, and he's so curious, and he just turned 50 years old and he still remains just a child in awe of the world. And I respect his ambition and his drive to just motivate people. You can tell when you listen to him that he just wants to share this wealth with everyone. This wealth of not only his gigantic compound with a workout facility and podcast station and all this crazy stuff, but he wants to share his mental wealth, like these ideas and this will to learn and push yourself and just test yourself in general as a human and see what you can accomplish. He's all about sharing that with the world. So yeah, I have to share that with you guys as number one. Number two on the list is going to be the Bad Christian Podcast. I imagine a lot of you have heard of this one, or maybe heard of the band Emery. They were a Christian metal band that got pretty popular in the early 2000s, and they're still kicking. Their new album is amazing, actually. I highly recommend that you guys check that out. But Bad Christian Podcast is a podcast that essentially sort of evolved from a band and church culture, if that makes any sense. All three of them used to be in ministry, and one of them still is, but I would say that they all are in a way. They started this new ministry that is the Bad Christian Podcast, and in my opinion, I mean, it's the future of church. These guys are just real. They're questioning everything. They're down to earth, and they're raw, and they don't filter anything. That's what attracted me to their podcast, because I don't know about you guys, but whenever I try to listen to something that's labeled as Christian, you can always just hear the filter. You can tell that there's things they're not saying. They're not really being raw. They're not really speaking their mind. And these guys are not afraid to be called heretics or bad Christians, obviously. So they talk about everything, especially the things that most Christians are very uncomfortable talking about. And they're just good Southern guys that love rock music and love God. And they don't like the church, though. So, or at least the church structure, the agrarian model that we all have our issues with. So the Bad Christian Podcast is a show where they interview all kinds of different people also, but they start out every episode with just them three, Joey, Matt, and Toby. And they're hilarious guys, and they talk about their week, and they catch up because they all live in different states. And they talk about, a lot of the time, whatever's relevant, whatever's going on in the world, and they kind of comment on it from their perspectives. And I imagine there's a lot of you out there that have evangelical backgrounds that would relate to a lot of what these guys are saying. And they kind of are showing the world that you can be a Christian but not fit into any of the monikers that evangelicals would call Christian. I'm sure there are a lot of people who think that these guys, actually, I've literally seen a tweet that says that one of them is a wolf in sheep's clothing leading people away from God. So that's obviously not what they're trying to do. They're actually bridging cultural and religious gaps between all kinds of different people, and they're doing really amazing work. It is controversial, but I love it. That's my type of stuff. So the Bad Christian Podcast is definitely one to check out. The third podcast that I wrote down is the Duncan Trussell Family Hour. Duncan Trussell is just one of the most hilarious and sweet individuals that I've ever heard. He, I think, achieved most of his fame and popularity from being friends with Joe Rogan. I think he was a young comedian just doing open mics and things like that, and Joe Rogan picked him up, and they became friends, and he started making appearances on the podcast and eventually started his own podcast. Actually, I think he might have been doing it even before that, but his podcast got a lot more popular, of course, once he made some appearances on the Joe Rogan Experience. But I'm sure you guys, if you listen to the Joe Rogan Experience, you've heard him talk about how Duncan essentially started a cult, and that's what his podcast is. And if I'm being completely honest, I can't disagree, because he's such a spiritual and philosophical guy that it is like a religious experience when you listen to him, because he has very little ego. Like, as weird as that sounds, like, and I know everyone has an ego, and I'm sure he deals with his own issues, but he comes at everything in such a different way that it just really opens up my mind when I listen to that podcast. And he does conversations just like everyone else with all kinds of really cool and interesting people, sometimes not even famous, sometimes they're just his friends. Sometimes they're like family members or other comedians or musicians or whatever, but he's kind of in that world with Aubrey Marcus and Joe Rogan and Chris Ryan and all those really well-established podcasters. He's been doing it for a long time, but he is definitely the most abstract and out there podcaster that I've heard. I mean, he does a lot of comedic segments, I would say. Like sometimes I don't even know what I'm listening to. Like he'll put effects on his voice, or he likes to make music with this little mixer type thing that he'll add in every now and then. He'll do these rants that he literally spends days trying to record that are just so strange and interesting. But I mean, it really does. It gets your mind going. It gets you thinking outside of the box. And Duncan Trussell is just a hilarious dude. So you guys should, you should listen to him for sure, because you're gonna learn something. Number 4 on the list is going to be Tangentially Speaking. Tangentially Speaking is hosted by a guy named Dr. Chris Ryan. And I'm actually going to start this one with a quote from him, just because I just found this on my phone, and I often write down things that he says because he accidentally says things that are noteworthy enough that they should be in a book, which is why he's a writer. That's actually what he was known for before he was podcasting. He wrote a book called Sex at Dawn that's all about human nature from the perspective of the hunter-gatherer, which is how humans were for most of our human history. So, the quote is, "Declarations of certainty are actually cries of doubt and fear." That's just something that he just casually just threw out while he was talking to somebody on a podcast about, I'm assuming, arrogant people or something like that. But that is just a small taste of just how intelligent and nuanced and how he sees these things. I guess I could expand on that. Declarations of certainty. Like, when you claim to know something, you're mostly trying to convince yourself at that point. And I think he hit the nail on the head. It's actually a declaration of doubt and fear, because you're only telling yourself whenever you try to convince someone else of your belief. And that's crazy that he's able to just stumble upon those things like it's nothing. But he's in his late 50s, so he's very wise. But I guess I have to tell you about his wife, Cathilda, who is, I think, from South Africa. He lived in Brazil most of his life, so he's traveled a lot and met all kinds of different people. And he met his wife in, I think, South Africa. But she moved to America for a bit and was a psychiatrist for a very, very long time, and recently decided in her early 60s to move halfway across the world to, I believe, Peru or somewhere around there, and study holistic medicine under a shaman. So she's learning what to her is a new form of healing, but a very, very old form of healing, and as far as history is concerned. The reason I bring up his wife is just because, I mean, they have such a interesting relationship, and I think that that's kind of a testament to who he is. They wrote a book that was essentially about non-monogamy. I mean, that's not the main point of it, but he's very into anthropology and how human nature really works, and questioning some of these social constructs of modern society that we just often look past. So it's really cool to hear him open these things up and just be brutally honest with himself and others about what you really want. And so he does solo episodes, he does conversations with people, he does these ones called Roma. It stands for ranting out my ass, which is pretty funny if you ask me. But he just talks about everything. He has an opinion about everything, but it's not really like an in-your-face opinion, because he'll just question things and make you question things and think about things and just be more honest with yourself. Chris Ryan has been called the shame exorcist, and I think that's probably one of the most perfect names for him, because he's so good at getting you to ask yourself, what do I really want? in life, just in general, because he's living proof that you can do almost anything. I mean, his wife at 60 some years old moved halfway across the world to study a whole nother thing that probably won't pay nearly as well as psychiatry, I would imagine. And he wrote a book and essentially lives in a van now and just travels the world. He calls it Vanthropology, which is actually what I named my rewards after on my Patreon page. I call it the Vanthropology Fund, thanks to Chris Ryan, because what he is doing is essentially meeting and studying human nature by just traveling and having amazing conversations. And he's such a nice and welcoming guy that the guests that he talked to usually end up like really opening up and being really just raw and honest about some of their emotions or things that they're going through. And it's like, it feels very therapeutic to hear people sort of overcome these things because they're talking to such a smart person who just gives them the permission not to feel bad about who they really are. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I think that you guys would take a lot from it if you checked it out. All right, guys, we're coming up on the halfway point. This might be a shorter episode. I'm not really sure how long it's going to be by the end of this. But anyways, the fifth one. And again, this is another one that I almost feel bad for having as number 5. It's so hard to pick my top 10. But The Minimalists. Joshua Fields Milbourne and Ryan Nicodemus are the hosts. And if you guys haven't seen the Netflix documentary Minimalism, a documentary about the important things, then I would highly recommend that first. That is like the perfect gateway into this idea of minimalism, which, if I'm being completely honest, like I said at the beginning, that Joe Rogan was a huge reason that I started podcasting. These guys are a huge reason that I just started doing in general, just started doing anything, and I quit making excuses for myself, and I quit trying to obtain things that I didn't really truly want or value. They're all about, like, one of their most famous phrases is, does that bring value to your life? And that's kind of one of the main questions that they ask themselves, and that they challenge you to ask yourself when it comes to anything, whether that is a physical possession, a relationship, a job, anything. Does it bring value to your life? If not, their philosophy is to shed the superfluous, which means you don't need it. You don't need anything. And what you really need is enough. We're always, we live in a world where everybody wants more, more, more. And these guys, they just want less. They want to show people that you can be actually way happier with less. And that's an amazing and freeing thing when you allow yourself or give yourself the permission to let go of keeping up with the Joneses, to let go of trying to live your life by comparison of what the world thinks that your life should look like. I empathize with this, and I really relate to it because I started out life immediately after high school with debt. I got a car and a car payment, and I decided to go to school. And I did all of these things to get what I want without recognizing the fact that I could just do what I want without going through all of these other things. I can have a car. I can make music. I can do what I want to do. I don't have to also fit in with the rest of society to do so. I was that person who would, I would figure out essentially what my budget is, how much money I make, and then when it came time to find an apartment or a house or whatever, I would get the most expensive and nicest house that I could afford. And I'm sure a lot of you know inherently that that's a stupid decision, but I learned it the hard way. I spent, the past several years, up until this past year or two, just trying to get by because I hadn't discovered this idea of minimalism, and I hadn't realized what is actually essential to achieving my goals and the things that I want to achieve. So the Minimalist podcast it's Josh and Ryan just talking. If I'm being completely honest, start at the beginning if you're going to listen to them, because their more recent ones have all been live podcasts. So you're going to get a lot of repetition, and they're good. But I guess I've heard all of those points because I listened to the beginning ones first. So I would highly recommend starting from the beginning and just gathering these concepts after you've watched the Netflix documentary, of course, just because that's their main thing. That's what kind of made them blow up, and that's why their podcast is so successful. But they just talk about everything from budgeting to living standards to relationships, and their whole philosophy is less is more. Is if you don't need it, don't take it. And they're very extreme on that. They call themselves the minimalists, obviously, so they don't own very many things. But these guys, they both had crazy careers. They were in some like cell phone marketing business or something, and they both had the big fancy house and the cars and all the money, and they were just miserable. And they realized that money and property and all of these things are not the key to happiness, and the key to happiness is actually just doing something meaningful, something that brings value to the world and value to your life. And I learned a lot from that concept. I plan on doing an episode about minimalism, actually, just because it's so important to my fundamental being and why I do things the way that I do, why I also won't do advertisements, and why I put so much effort into the Patreon and all these things. I learned a lot from Josh and Ryan, the Minimalists. So the Minimalists podcast is another one that you guys would definitely enjoy. The next one that I'm going to present to you guys is called The Liturgists. And I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar. I'm sure a lot of you are also unfamiliar with liturgy. And I believe, and I could be totally wrong, I could be butchering this definition, but liturgy is essentially just like a religious practice. So I think there are a lot of churches that perform liturgy, although they don't connect to one specific theological doctrine. And so I guess this one is definitely for the Bible thumpers out there like myself, the people that have an evangelical background or some sort of spiritual background and who just want to learn about faith and culture and I guess hear it from really smart people. But I'm sure a lot of you have already heard of Michael and Lisa Gungor, or the band Gungor, or the song Beautiful Things. I'm sure if you've been at a church in the past 10 years, you've probably heard a Gungor song. But so Michael and Lisa, and then their friend Science Mike. And Science Mike is also another cool guy. But those three are the hosts. They essentially just talk about faith, and they pick usually a specific topic. But the ones that I'm gonna recommend first are the episodes that are kind of early on, titled Lost and Found. And essentially these are the hosts telling the story of when they lost their faith for the first time. If you're somebody of faith or somebody who believes in really anything, there's been a time in your life that you lost that belief, or that you stopped believing in that thing, and that thing had to reintegrate itself into your life in a whole different and new way. And that's what's I've been through that. I've been going through that. I think I'm still in the process. As you guys can tell, I'm wrestling with a lot of faith-related and theological and philosophical things. So The Liturgist is just a great way for me to learn about other forms of spirituality, other flavors of Christianity, because I believe that Gungor was a Calvinist originally for the longest time. I'm not really sure. I could be wrong on that. But they all three of them had very different theological beliefs, and I would say are on the cutting edge of Christianity and what it is today and what it will be in the future, because they really take scripture apart and examine it, and they look at it in a whole new way, and they really consider the cultural context in which it was written and who wrote it and how they wrote it and who they wrote it to and things like that. So they're just really honest with their take when it comes to scripture and theology. And I learn a lot from listening to these guys. So the Liturgist Podcast. All right, number 7, Star Talk Radio, hosted by Neil deGrasse Tyson. I'm sure most of you guys have heard of him, but if not, then get on Netflix again. Go watch the show Cosmos. Just the first episode, I guarantee will blow your mind. And if you like that and you want to hear more stuff like that, then Star Talk Radio is the way to be. I think you can probably find video of it because it's definitely recorded in front of a live crowd, so I'm assuming they're also filming, but I usually just listen to it on iTunes on the podcast format just because I like to multitask. But Star Talk Radio is essentially a show where he interviews in front of a live crowd another scientist, usually, not always, but it's probably, the majority is probably other practitioners of some form of science. But he also brings a comedian on just for the heck of it. I think every episode. And they provide comic relief, and it's hilarious. They usually don't know a lot about science or what they're talking about, so they'll try to keep up, and they'll just ask really funny questions and kind of liven up the room a little bit and make it a little less nerdy, I guess, and a little bit less scientific, a little bit more entertainment. Although I could go for just the science, but I do admit that the comic relief helps. But yeah, you guys would probably, if you're into space and quantum physics and evolution and all of those nerdy science things like I am, then you will love Star Talk Radio. I know that. Neil deGrasse Tyson is one of the most brilliant astrophysicists of our time, and I think we're truly blessed that we get to learn from him because he's got this childlike heart that's just so eager to learn. And although he knows more than most humans, he's humble enough to continue to ask great questions and to learn from other scientists in other fields and expand his knowledge even more. And your knowledge will also be expanded if you listen to Star Talk Radio. That is for sure. And that brings us to number 8. Bear with me, guys. We're almost there. If you're still listening, you're awesome. I don't know if this is boring or not. I really don't. If I'm boring you, I'm truly sorry. But The Lead Singer Syndrome is another great podcast. These are all great, but Shane Told from the band Silverstein, I think maybe almost 2 years now, started this podcast, and he just interviews other lead singers, and it's awesome. I learn a lot from it, just being a musician who still has dreams to travel on the road and play music to live crowds. So I learn a lot listening to the ground floor of the music industry, and especially this punk rock, post-core, hardcore, any type of like rock genre. I mean, if you guys are familiar with the band Silverstein, then you're familiar with that scene. And that's who Shane likes to talk to, or are just other people that he's able to get into contact with. Every now and then he'll have a pop or rap or hip hop artist, or he'll branch out a little bit. But for the most part, it's rock singers, which that's a very different world than a lot of other music related things. So yeah, it's just Shane's a really great guy. He's a really friendly dude, and it seems like everybody who he talks to really enjoys talking to him. And I really enjoy listening to it, and I find it as a good way to keep up on some of my favorite bands and artists and to just hear new music, because there are a lot of bands that I've heard of, but I never really took the time out of my day to listen to until I listened to their lead singer talk to Shane Told for an hour and just listen to how much blood, sweat, and tears they put into their new album, and then I have to check it out because I'd feel bad if not. So yeah, Shane Told, the host of The Lead Singer Syndrome. That's a great podcast for any of you music lovers out there. So I highly recommend that, especially if you love punk rock, because Shane Told's probably one of the biggest punk rock enthusiasts out there. He probably owns a t-shirt from every band you've ever heard of. So yeah, that's a great one. Another great one is a podcast called Radiolab. Radiolab is a bit more of a production. It's kind of like listening to a documentary or like watching a TV show, only you're not seeing it, obviously. But it's pretty random, to be honest. Like, I heard one a while ago about CRISPR and like gene editing and things like that. Or they'll have one that's about some crazy court trial or some new scientific discovery. It's kind of like the news, only in a documentary format, a very journalistic format, actually. And they travel all around the world and they interview people, and then they come back to the studio and they talk about those interviews. And it's a very, very well done, very well edited and produced show. And I learned so much in listening to them, because they cover the most broad topics, and it's usually something that is important or relevant to whatever is going on in the world. So it's a good, I wouldn't say source of all news, but it is a good way to learn about some of the more current trends in the world, and some of the more technological advances, or some crazy story that just came out of nowhere. They're probably going to have a podcast about just about everything. So that's a really good one to start out with if you're unfamiliar with podcasting, just because it's so well made, and it's a very broad genre. It's got something for everyone. So yeah, I would recommend Radiolab to just about anybody. It's a lot of these that I've been talking about are very specific, and there's a small niche of people that are going to actually go and listen to them. But this one, anybody can listen to it, and you're gonna enjoy it, and you're gonna find some entertainment. So that's a good one. We made it to number 10. Number 10 is not the most popular, probably the least listened to on this list, but it is still great, because it's, to be honest, the first podcast I ever started listening to. It's called Irenicast, and these are just 3 pretty normal people from, I believe, California, who are just some of the most mindful and intelligent people that I've heard talk. I guess I got to get into how I actually started listening to podcasts to even explain it. But basically, I got tired of listening to music every day at work. I was running out of things to listen to. I clean cars, so I can wear headphones like most of the day. So I just started, I downloaded TuneIn, some podcast app, before I had an iPhone, and just started like typing in random topics. And at the time, I wanted to learn about some theological things. So I started just looking up certain topics, and I found Irenicast out of complete randomness. There's probably no way that any of you guys have heard of Irenicast, just because it's a smaller podcast. They are growing and they're doing great things. But yeah, it's Alan, Mona, and Jeff are the 3 hosts, and they talk about faith and culture. That's kind of their main thing. And it seems like everything is usually related to faith in one way or another. But they've been doing a lot of other stuff. They've been branching out. They'll do movie reviews. They actually did this really great podcast about the movie Inside Out, the Pixar film, if you guys have seen it. Just listening to them break that down and kind of explain as they're learning about just how much thought was put into that movie. It's very, very interesting. I really enjoyed it. But I also really enjoy their podcast about homosexuality and Christianity, evolution, the Bible. Just, they have all kinds of episodes that are very specific topics that a lot of us don't like to talk about. A lot of us, look past those things, and these people like to break those things down and kind of open them back up. I would relate a lot of what they do to Bad Christian, only a very different style. But yeah, I gotta mention Irenicast just because they are the people that essentially got me listening to podcasts, and that is what spawned into everything that I just named and more. So yeah, thank you guys so much for muscling through an entire episode about podcasts. I don't know about you guys, but I think this is probably one of the most important and greatest mediums in existence. I think it's the future of how people will receive information just because of how efficient and open the market is. Anyone can start a podcast. I truly mean that. I had no idea what went into this a year ago, and I like to believe that I'm getting pretty good at it. It's definitely getting better. I have a lot of learning to do and a lot of growing and a lot of expanding as far as production and getting better at not saying and asking better questions and all that. But you guys keep listening and you keep making it worth it. So I'd like to hear what your favorite podcasts are. So let me know. I want to hear it. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of the Better Ideas podcast. If you enjoyed it, you can find more at patreon.com/betterideas. There you will find everything that I've ever uploaded with a little bit of extra content, and you can consider supporting the show monetarily there. If you choose to do so, you'll get some extra perks like extra episodes, early releases, maybe even a t-shirt, who knows. If not, you can just follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of the social medias. You can go to iTunes.com and leave me a 5-star rating, or you can just keep listening. Until then, guys, have a good week.